to continue, please mute yourself when you're not speaking to avoid background noise, and do not hesitate to use the chat for your comments and questions. So the webinar and the lecture is given by my colleague, Dr. Julia Korkman, and she will do it in different sets. And after each set, there's time for questions and comments from the audience. And we will also make the slides available later on. And then if you want to tag us in social media, we would be very happy if you could use the electthb hashtag, which is elect_THB. And then I will just say a few words about the electthb project. So this is a 2-year project that we've developed in close cooperation with law enforcement and other authorities in Finland, Estonia, and Latvia. We are funded from the European Internal Security Program, police part, from that funding program, and this is a 2-year project that is coming to an end now in end of August. And basically the outcomes of ELECT will strengthen the capacity to investigate and prosecute trafficking cases, disrupt the financial gains of trafficking, and help victims access justice. What we have been doing in the past 2 years, here's a list of some of the project activities. We've just this spring organized international training workshops in Tallinn and Riga, focusing on labor trafficking and trafficking for sexual exploitation. We are also organizing national trainings and policymaker dialogues. Instead of a final conference, we will do 3 of these webinars. This is the first one, and then we will do 2 more webinars in August, but the dates are a bit flexible yet, so I don't introduce the dates right now. We also developed a visualization tool. There's an outcome report focusing on some of the work that we've done in mapping the latest trends of human trafficking and the modus operandi of traffickers. There's also 2 policy briefs that we are publishing, and then we are developing an online training resource, which will include materials and videos about the main findings. So just very shortly as an introduction to the work on modus operandi that we've done during the project. We did a data collection in our 3 countries plus in Poland and Ukraine, collected statistical information, and then did a desk review and collected relevant media articles and case examples, as well as did interviews with authorities, businesses, and third sector actors last year. And then La Strada International was hired to conduct mappings focusing on the most recent trafficking trends in Poland and Ukraine. So this is as a background of some of the work, analytical work that we've done. And as part of the main finding and the kind of issue for the selection of topic for this webinar, the psychological control. So during the analysis that we've done, there's quite clearly a shift from using physical control to a variety of subtle means of psychological control in many of the countries we've mapped. And this is also relevant for different forms of trafficking and exploitation. So, for example, trafficking for sexual exploitation, labor trafficking, but also forced criminality, forced begging, and so on. And as a result of this use of more subtle means of control, the exploitation might not be so visible to outsiders because the victims are not necessarily restricted so in their everyday life activities. So the invisible chain, so to speak. And the offenders may pressure and force the victims in complex ways that are difficult to detect and are based on establishment of a personal relationship with the victim, and they utilize trauma bond in doing this, which obviously poses major challenges in investigation and prosecution of human trafficking cases by law enforcement authorities and criminal justice actors. So therefore, I'm very happy that we have such a good colleague at Heuni, who has then helped us in developing training materials on how these challenges could be overcome. And during her lecture, she will give us more insights on what we know about this issue and what kind of solutions there might be to collect evidence on such things. So without further ado, I then give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Julia Korkman. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Annina, and good morning or good day to everyone. I'm happy to be presenting here. I will immediately make sure the slide sharing works as the first thing. And Annina, can you confirm that you can see the screen in the way it is supposed to be seen?
Yes, it looks good. And sorry, I missed that. I was kicked out of the meeting for a second.
Okay. Well, you were quick to be back.
Yes. So I will put the recording is on already. Okay. Yes.
Perfect.
Good.
Okay. So in this webinar, which is concerned with human trafficking and investigating human trafficking and encountering victims of human trafficking, I will touch, of course, rather briefly in view of time on actually 6 different topics that are of relevance. And in this talk, I will begin by talking a little bit about the foundations regarding memory, because memory is, of course, very crucial. Witness testimony is all about memory. And I think before we even start talking about memories of traumatic events, we need to understand memory more generally. So just a few aspects that I think are really important for the criminal justice system to understand about how memory works. Then I will also do the same regarding investigative interviewing. What is the knowledge we today have about how investigative interviewing should be conducted, again, in general? Then I will talk a little bit about traumatic experiences and encounters in the criminal justice system, particularly from the point of view of what we know about trafficking victims, and then move on to psychological coercion and control. And then the 5th part is maybe then the most practically geared one in relation to investigating suspicions of human trafficking. It's about how to use what we know about interviewing and memory and trauma in general, what we know about trafficking more specifically, and how to use this in the investigative interviews and when assessing witness accounts, for example. And time allowing, I will also say a few words about interpretation, which is, of course, crucial in many instances of trafficking where parts in the process need an interpreter to be able to communicate with one another. And between these parts, there will be a small break for possible questions and also just to breathe a little. And halfway through this, maybe around 11:50 or so, we'll have a 5 minutes comfort break. So memory, the foundations regarding memory of relevance for the criminal justice system. When we talk about memory in this context, we talk about the autobiographical memory, which is the memory of our experiences. There are many other kinds of memories that are really important for people in general, but when you look at witnesses, and by witnesses I mean both victims and even suspects and eyewitnesses, the autobiographical memory tends to be the kind of memory we really are looking for. So it's the memories of our own life experiences. And this is separate from, for example, semantic memory, which is knowledge. So we know that Paris is France's capital, but we rarely are able to remember when we learned this piece of information. And of course, this can be of relevance also in criminal justice processes. But when we discuss the experiences of victims, there we are really talking about autobiographical memory. Procedural memory, again, is automatized sort of mechanic behavior. You, for example, learn to walk and drive a bicycle or a car, and when you've learned it, you don't need to pay attention to it anymore unless something else comes along that sort of takes your attention. Again, sometimes this kind of automatized memory can be even of relevance in criminal justice system or processes, because it can lead to people reacting in a very automatic way that actually can maybe say something about their experiences. But as evidence, they are rarely seen in courts, and maybe justly so. We also have sensoric memory, which is smells and touches, noises, etc. And these are actually interesting from the point of view of trauma, because it seems that our senses are sharpened when we are in a traumatic or scary situation. So these memories can actually be more vivid when we recall something that has been really traumatic. But again, autobiographical memory is the kind of memory we are dealing with when we are in the criminal justice system context. The novelist Alice Munro has said that memory is the way we keep telling ourselves our stories and telling other people a somewhat different version of our stories. And I think this is really what autobiographical memory is about. It's how we sort of make our memories, our experiences into accounts that somehow make sense to us or that are understandable. And it's quite clear that these stories can change over time, and they can change depending on who we are telling them to. And they also change when we develop as human beings, when we further our understanding of the world. And in the case of victims in a criminal process, it can very well be that for some victims, a realization of being victimized is something that grows sort of slowly. So while the memory of events that have happened may be the same, the understanding of them may differ from one point of time in another. For example, in victims of crimes in intimate relationships, it's not unfrequent that the victim sort of fails to see themselves perhaps as victims of serious, for example, physical and sexual violence, while still in the relationship. They are sort of taking the point of view of the perpetrator, and maybe also in a way to shield themselves from this realization of their situation. They are sort of making up excuses for the perpetrator. And only when out of that relationship, they may perhaps be able to see their experiences from another point of view. And the same might be very relevant in cases of human trafficking. When we look at autobiographical memory and the memories of our experiences, they differ from one culture to another, and they differ from one family or one subculture to another. When you look at how autobiographical memory develops from childhood on, and of course, all the foundations of how we discuss our experiences, how we remember them, how we interpret them, come from early childhood, or they start developing in early childhood. We know that the development of language is very important for the development of memory, and in particular for this kind of memory. So when children grow up in surroundings where they are encouraged to talk about their experiences, or there are much discussions about what they have experienced, and the parents or other adults sort of give them words for what they have just been through, these children will obviously have an easier time in verbalizing their experiences. So they will be better at describing them verbally, which also actually helps them remember them better. It seems that it is very, very rare that people have any memories before the time they learn to talk or at least understand language fluently. And if there are such memory traces, it tends to be like very, very vague and something related perhaps to sounds or so. And this is not to say that there are no memories formed before people learn how to talk, because we know that already in the uterus, the unborn child learns to recognize both smells and sounds and other tastes and sounds and other things. But these are not explicit memories that they could tell about later. So the first memories we are able to talk about tend to be after the time we have learned how to talk fluently. So again, it's really dependent on the social surroundings, and this is important in the criminal justice system, where there are quite a lot of expectations of how people should be able to describe their experiences. And we cannot actually understand we cannot have reasonable expectations if we don't know about their background, at least to the extent that we can have some kind of idea of whether this background has been such that they have been able to learn how to communicate. There is a lot of very interesting research on cultural variations, also with regards to autobiographical memory. Ki Wang is one of the researchers I would very much recommend to look at. She has looked at different aspects, in particular of the development of memory, and compared Asian and US populations, and found certain group level differences that of course are not necessarily there in each individual from sort of representing these cultures, but that do seem to be seen on the group level. For example, when looking at adults who have grown up in traditionally Chinese environments, it has been found that they have slightly later first memories than the US participants or US persons growing up in traditional US surroundings, and that the memories are more related to social interactions of the group, while the US participants have more memories related to what they themselves as sort of main actors have done. And this seems to be an indication of what I think cultural anthropologists for decades have known as differences between holistic and individualistic cultures. So the sort of weight is put at either the individual's own experiences or the group more as a whole. And these are things that I do quite a lot of training and supervision of police officers, asylum officials, judges, prosecutors, etc. And this is something that quite often is talked about among professionals who encounter many people with different cultural backgrounds, that it's quite clear that from certain cultures, it's less likely that they would remember exact names of actors, for example, but they can remember more of some other social interaction. So what we remember is very much also influenced by our culture. It's also maybe important in the context of human trafficking, where many victims tend to be young, teenagers or very young adults, that this autobiographical memory has aspects that are really among the last to develop. We know that cognitively children develop quite fully by the age of 16 when it comes to sort of intellectual, we call it cold cognition, cold knowledge, or skills, thinking skills. But when we talk about more emotional aspects, the development goes on for much, much longer. And we know that risk-taking or understanding the perspective of others are things that actually develop for much, much longer than that, until maybe even 25. But among things that really develop for a long time is, as I said, understanding the motives of others, reasons for actions and events, and the perspective of others. But also issues such as why one, like causal relationships, why one thing leads to another, or what one action can result in. And this may put young people at a greater risk both to be victimized and manipulated, also to take risks, but also in their interaction with criminal justice actors. So they may not realize how their actions, as for example, in a victim interview, what the consequences may be at a later point, even if the police is giving a short description of their rights and obligations and what their actions may lead to. And here is one thing where I think we should put much more effort in making sure that people understand their role in any legal process. And for example, if they are, like in the asylum context, where they are actually, the burden is on them to explain all their reasons for seeking asylum, or already at the onset of the procedures, and this might be quite hard actually to understand for applicants. We have very fresh Finnish research showing that this is actually the case. Okay, and then also issues such as time, the timing of events, the structuring memories in around certain episodes of life, these are all developing slowly, gradually, and at a different pace, and also differently from one culture to another. And just as an example, which is really crucial in the criminal justice system, time. We do tend to ask about the timing of events and the length of episodes. And these are issues that the human memory is not very good at recording and recalling. There is no such aspect of our brain that is sort of wired to register exactly what year an event took place. It's much more important if it's crucial to us, if something has been dangerous to us, that we have to avoid that place, for example. But timing is something we are naturally quite bad at, most of us. And also this is, of course, culture related. In a culture where calendars have not been in use, it's obvious that months and years have far less impact or relevance than in a culture where calendars and watches are more relevant. And the reason I want to talk about this here in the beginning of this lecture is that the expectations on memory by the legal system, by the criminal justice system, by the asylum system, are, in my opinion, and there is quite some evidence for this, quite flawed. So there are expectations of witnesses, victims, suspects being able to give details that actually human beings are not so good at remembering. For example, Tanja van Veldhuizen, who is a Dutch researcher, she did her PhD some years ago on asylum procedures, where one study was looking at the kinds of questions that are asked by asylum applicants regarding where they come from and how they have gotten to the country where they are now. The questions were such that they probably were intuitively reasonable to ask. For example, describing a central place in the town you live, or describing how the currency in use in your native country, how it looks. But actually, there is no research on how good we are at these kinds of things, or there was not before Tanja van Veldhuizen started her excellent research project. We now know that, for example, if you ask a person, if here in EU countries where the euro is frequently used, if you ask people to describe a 20-euro bill, which I regularly do in my lectures, people are incredibly bad at it. They know the color and that it says 20, and almost everything else is impossible to say. Of course, anyone who has been using this currency to any greater extent would recognize it, but they are very bad typically at describing it. This is just one example. Then we have an example, for example, in our asylum, we have a large asylum interview project in collaboration with Åbo Akademi University, where we have looked both at the way asylum applicants are interviewed and the way the decisions are taken based on these accounts. And here we have, among other things, looked at these kinds of assumptions on how people should react, how people should describe their experiences. And there are quite a few problems of them. This is just one example of a poor question regarding memory. What I mean is, how did your father's parents treat your mother when you were 2 years and still lived in X country? Of course, this is impossible in many ways. It's a really hard question, but it's also impossible for a two-year-old even to have any memories to begin with, but in particular to have complex memories such as this. This would probably be impossible for a 7 or 10-year-old as well. So this is, of course, not a good example, and I think it's easy to see that. When we look at memory, we have to realize that memory is really a process. When you ask someone to tell about their experiences, it's not like pressing a button. They have to actively try to draw from their memory sources what they remember. And we can actually hamper that by asking the wrong kinds of questions, and I will soon get into that. But it's important to realize that when I was actually yesterday asked by a journalist about an old case that they had interviewed all the participants or people who had been actually in a quite traumatic situation, and they all seemed to have differing memories. But this was many, many years ago, and I said anything else would actually be very surprising, because already when the situation occurs, we will pay attention to slightly different things, and in a rapidly evolving situation, we will also draw conclusions on what is going on based on our previous experiences. And then some of us might have been in similar situations earlier, and we might understand what's going on, and then it's much easier to interpret what is going on now. But if the situation is completely new to us, we will be likely to be quite incapable of understanding what's going on, which hampers how we can remember it. Of course, most of the things we see and experience also drop out of our memory quite soon. So we actually maintain only a small part. But we do tend to maintain what is really relevant to us, what is related to emotions, what is dangerous, what is very interesting or important. And of course, if something is life-threatening, this tends to be among the things that we actually do remember better than many other things. However, distortions can happen in any phase. So we might interpret a situation slightly differently than it happened, and we may, over time, how it is shaped may actually change. And then in the interview or in a discussion with other people about what we have experienced, we might actually incorporate some of the other people's assumptions into our own memories without absolutely noticing this. So if I see a car crash and somebody else says, well, you saw that it was the bigger car that drove, was crashing into the smaller car, in a situation where I haven't really seen a lot, this could easily impact my own memory, and this could easily be what I report to the police unknowingly or unaware of the fact that actually this is the other participant's interpretation and not my own. So our memories may change as the result of suggestive questions, and we may also be quite sensitive to trying to respond in the way an authority seems to want us to respond. So if, for example, in this car crash eyewitness situation, if the police would say, how fast was the bigger car driving when it crashed into the smaller one, I might easily think that, oh, they know it's the big car that crashed into the small one, and I would interpret my small memory fragments from that point of view. And here again, we know that some people are much more vulnerable to being to feeling this social pressure to conform to certain kinds of questions. Children, adolescents, elderly, vulnerable persons in general are more susceptible to suggestion. For example, vulnerable may mean substance abusers, people with mental health issues, also to some extent traumatized people. On the other hand, I think it must be noted that most people can be perceived as to some extent vulnerable when interacting with the criminal justice system. But it's also important to realize that suggestion may lead to entirely false accounts. So this is really important when we look at the way victims, witnesses, also suspects are interviewed in the criminal justice system. We have some research showing that when you have a group of eyewitnesses seeing the same situation, the account of one witness may actually influence all the others' accounts. This is a Swedish study showing just that. And there's also research that in experimental settings, where researchers ask participants in the research to tell about their childhood experiences, if the researcher introduces a claim that the participant has experienced something that they indeed have not experienced, the participants may actually start remembering events that have never occurred. This is one example from one study where participants were shown, this is now the small boy in the picture is now the adult participant in the research, and he's shown 4 pictures, of which 3 are real pictures from his childhood, and the 4th one is manipulated so that he and his father at the time of his childhood were moved into a hot air balloon, and he is then just asked, do you remember this event? Do you remember this event? Do you remember this event? And indeed, participants do not tend to remember this event immediately. But in all the studies that have been conducted, a large minority of about a 4th or a 3rd do rather quickly develop false memories of these kinds of events. So they start thinking, well, it must have been when we were in Australia, and my mother probably took the picture because she is afraid of heights. And then in the next interview, they already have a clear memory of how the mother looked when she took the pictures. So indeed, it is about telling ourselves stories about our past. According to this research, then, we have to thread very carefully when we deal with memories in the criminal justice system, because every time we interact and discuss and work with memories, we might change the landscape to some extent. It's an allegory to a snowy landscape where after, like, as soon as we discuss the event with someone, the landscape changes to some extent, and it can't be changed back into the original. But we have to, of course, take into account what made those memory traces. Annina, if there is any question now on the first part, the memory part, then we can take them, and if not, then you can, during the talk, also put in questions in the chat.
Yeah, Julia, so far no questions in the chat.
Okay, then we'll just move on. I will now talk about investigative interviewing and just some very crucial principles that should be followed in all situations where criminal victims or witnesses or indeed suspects are heard within the criminal justice system. Basically, it's about this. How you ask is what you get. You should focus on recall memory rather than recognition. It's easier for people if they are asked, for example, was the man dark-haired or light-haired? It may be easier to answer, but there's always a risk that a person who has seen someone and they do not recall if they had hair at all, or what color it was, or whether they might have had a hat. If they had some idea that this person maybe was not at least dark, they might say he had blonde hair. And then in the next interview, they might already be convinced that the hair was blonde. Instead, you should ask, tell me about the man, tell me everything you remember of that man, for example. It's also acknowledged that enabling as full accounts as possible requires time, a calm atmosphere, and a sense of trust. And this is really where the criminal justice system actors need to work more. We do know that in many instances, police interrogations are not conducted with this perspective perhaps enough in mind. Some are, but there's a great variation in I think, throughout European countries at least. And also when people are heard in court, the situation might be rather stressful, and still the court proceeding may be really dependent on what these people remember and what they say about their experiences. So there would be more work to do here. And for instance, in some countries, during the pandemic, I would say probably in all countries, remote hearings have increased, and some findings indicate that many vulnerable witnesses can indeed feel that they are in a better place if they are heard remotely than rather within the courtroom with all people present, and maybe this sense of really a formal kind of atmosphere. So this is one thing to look at. Then again, in the interview, you should not ask questions that sort of imply what kind of answer is expected or that are likely to influence the witness's memories too much. This has been researched now for many, many decades, and here you see a very one of the sort of first well-known studies where a big group of participants were asked about how fast were the cars going. But the group was divided into 5 subgroups, and the question was then a little bit altered from one group to the other. So one group was asked when they smashed, one when they collided, one when they bumped, one when they hit, and one when they contacted each other. And when the participants tried to establish the speed of the cars, they were really affected by this change in the way the question was asked. So if they were asked about a smash, then they were much more likely to estimate that the cars were driving more quickly. When they were asked about contacting, they weren't driving all that fast. And this implies that really already with varying one word in a question might have an effect on how witnesses later remember and interpret what they have seen. So this is really something that has to be paid attention to in investigative interviews or when persons are heard in court. The problem with closed and leading questions is that closed questions, if they are abundant in an interview, they tend to then lead to an account that depicts the expectation of the interviewer, for example, the police officer, rather than the experiences of the person who is heard. And this may be really highly problematic. Another thing is that we need in interviews to focus on central themes rather than peripheral details. Because if we ask specifically about the color of something, the amount of minutes or exactly in centimeters how tall someone was, or other issues like this, people may feel a pressure to respond, but the responses may be much less exact. And it is quite possible to get very much information by posing open questions that can focus on certain sub-themes very clearly, but still are open. So you do not ask how many minutes were you there, but you could ask, can you tell me from when you got there until you went away, everything that you remember happening. You can also, when you ask about persons or relationships, tell me about how you interacted with this person and tell me more about this person, etc. So the tendency, this is the problem of suggestive questions, as we already saw. This has been acknowledged in many evidence-based interviewing methods, both for victims, witnesses, and suspects. And there are, of course, slight differences, but they all share this notion that you need to establish a good report and you need to focus on recall questions and try to make the person tell everything they remember. And especially the cognitive interview has been around very long and is, I would say, the basis for all evidence-based interviewing techniques, and the PEACE model, which is, has been used for a long time in the UK, is now in place in different versions in many different countries, and it has just been endorsed by the UN in what is known as the Mendes Principles, that is now rapidly gaining attention throughout the world. And these Mendes Principles were actually based on concern that suspects were interrogated in manners that were torture-like, that were risky in terms of leading to false confessions. But these principles are very much true for any kind of witness or a victim also. So the principles very quickly, and this is these are slides by Professor Dave Walsh, and with his permission, the principles are that the effective interviewing should be evidence-based, they should be based on how memory works, and also, of course, on ethical principles and on the law. Effective interviewing is really a quite comprehensive process, and we need to consider vulnerability of witnesses and victims, and indeed suspects. Then we need to train our interviewers. Interviewing needs to be transparent. We have to be able to see how interviews are conducted. And we need to make sure the implementation has robust national measures. A last comment on investigative interviewing is that we do know that the best way of preserving witnesses' victims' memories would be as soon as possible when they have experienced something, and that their first interviews would be video or at least audio recorded, so we would have that very that as fresh as possible testimony to look at also later, and also to avoid victims having to repeatedly describe all the aspects of their experiences. This is just one study with the title of which says it all, Losing 2/3 of the Story. Here they compared recorded videos from the pretrial investigation about 2 weeks after the assault with court hearings almost 2 years later. And when comparing the amount of information, 2/3 almost was lost. So the victim, of course, pays dearly for this. Anina, I have to check. There is some sounds behind me. Does it disturb?
Yeah, we can hear somebody probably nailing something.
Yeah.
But hammering something.
It's the neighboring house. I'll go and close the door, so we'll take a 1-minute break. Just
yes,
1 second.
Okay. So now if you have any questions or thoughts, you might take this time to write something in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, Julia, still no comments in the chat, except will the presentation slides be available? And yes, they are.
They are, and also some further sources for different parts of the topics. Thank you. Okay. We'll then dive into particularities related to traumatic experiences. And of course, many of the victims we encounter in the criminal justice system are traumatized or at least vulnerable. And this has to be taken into account. And one of the really clear findings all over is that the importance of rapport and support for victims to talk about difficult things cannot be overestimated. And here, this is something that in many police trainings is not really part of the curricula. In some countries it is, but this has to be much more recognized than what it is. And this is also something that you can actually train much more than what maybe previously has been the expectation. I already gave a bad example from a Finnish asylum interview from our recent research project here, so I also want to show a good example. Here, the interviewer clearly recognizes how difficult giving the account is for the asylum applicant. And they are saying, and this could be in any context where you interview a person about difficult experiences, you don't have to tell us more than you can manage. We understand that you are ill and that you're having a hard time speaking of these things. And then at a later point, you can relax, everything is fine. And again later, we are here for you to look into your story and you can tell us as much as you can. And then later on, thank you for telling us these difficult parts of your story. And this is, I think, really an indication of showing in every way that we are supportive of you. Recall, especially recalling difficult issues, requires allowing flow. It requires time, so you have to allow a certain flow and associating, and you also have to be comfortable with having some silent pauses and let the person think and sort of maybe verbalize themselves how they want to talk about the issues. It requires on the part of the interviewee quite a bit of concentration, like really going back in your mind and maybe closing your eyes, thinking of everything from that situation, what you saw, what you heard, what did you, who was there. So in the cognitive interview, for example, that I mentioned, this is really one of the main starting points. You can tell people that I now want you to really go back into that situation and think as closely as you can about it. It has to be noted, though, that if you have a very traumatized person in front of you, it can be that this kind of intensive going back to the situation, reinstating the context of the situation, may be too difficult. So you have to be a bit careful here. But you do need to have a calm situation. We know that stress hampers memory. Again, this goes also, of course, in court and in other situations. Research also shows that a good rapport between the interviewee and the interviewer is essential, as mentioned. And then when remembering trauma, we know that in general we remember things that are of importance to us, and trauma is certainly, the traumatic situations, scary situations certainly are these kinds of situations. But there is some evidence that in traumatic and very scary situations, our focus tends to be even more than in other kinds of situations on the very most crucial issues, perhaps the most life-threatening issues. And this may lead to memories that are slightly more skeletal than others. So it can be on the expense of other details, of less important details. This can be really a problem for the traumatized victim because our criminal justice system quite often sort of counts the details and is looking for as many details as possible. And this might not be an accurate expectation if you have a very traumatized person in front of you. And we also know that while moderate stress helps us focus and remember, so it makes us alert, what's going on. But if we are really terrified, this actually often hampers memory. And you've seen it, for example, in studies where people have been interrogated in really harsh ways. There has been even field studies comparing people who have been interrogated in a way that is almost torture-like. And these have been compared to people who have been interrogated in a harsh but not torture-like way. And those who were interrogated in a harsh way had a much easier time, for example, in recognizing the interviewer. But those who were really interrogated in a terrifying way, they struggled to remember, even to recognize the face of the interrogator. So high stress really can influence memory negatively. And of course, then, even if there is a clear memory of a terrifying event, it may be significantly stressful to talk about it. So we know, for example, for rape victims who have this freezing reaction that I'm sure many of you have heard about, where the rape victim actually freezes and simply cannot move, cannot act. This has been quite well established now during the last years that this is indeed an existing reaction, and there's been now some research trying to look at whether these rape victims then remember worse or better when they are, so to say, freezed. And it seems this freezing reaction does not paralyze memory, so they actually seem to remember better than when they have this freeze reaction than otherwise. But there's still not loads of research on this. But for example, Richard McNally, who's a professor in trauma research, he has recently published an interesting article on this. In general, trauma, I mean, most of the people who have been victims of different types of crimes have been subject to potentially traumatizing situations. This does not mean everyone is traumatized in the way when we talk about giving a diagnosis or really having post-traumatic stress disorder. And in fact, most people who experience traumatizing events do self-heal, which means that after a few months, they can carry on. These memories won't be nice. It won't be an easy thing. They might still have struggle when thinking about them, but they are not. They do not have such an effect that the victims would not be able to move on with their lives or lead a relatively normal life. However, we do know that one of the very typical symptoms of being traumatized is avoidance. So many traumatized persons, it's one of the features of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, this pattern of avoidance. So the person really does not want to think about the traumatic experience. They try to avoid it in every way possible. And of course, this can lead to the memory being less well retained. But it usually, if you really talk about a person who is traumatized, it may also have the effect that the memory actually comes back in different ways, in nightmares or in flashbacks, and it's really impossible to avoid it. If a person tries to avoid something until as far as possible, this might, of course, also lead to a life which is very difficult to lead in a normal way. So if you have been in a car accident and this has been really traumatizing, it might lead you to try to avoid anything that reminds you of cars. And if you live in an industrialized country, that might be really quite difficult to do without really stopping seeing anyone around you. Luckily, there are very good therapeutic ways to work with traumatic memories, evidence-based such. There are also many ways in which traumatic memories are dealt with, which are not evidence-based. So here again, as a scientist, I would say that we have to be very clear on what kinds of treatments are offered to victims. Specific traumatic memories may endure as flashbacks. Highly emotional memories, they may be really impossible to forget. And people who experience ongoing stress, long periods of traumatic situations, this takes its toll on memory. And I think most people also here in the audience probably can recognize this from own periods of life. If you have gone through a very painful divorce or lost a near person or had a period that was really very, very difficult, many do have the everyday experience that it's harder to remember other things from that period, for example, or that you didn't function as well in university or school or at work as you would have otherwise. And this is because your memory, your whole cognition was really occupied with these difficult emotions, with like staying somehow sane in that context. Also, clear narratives, if you talk about children who are growing up in very chaotic and strange situations, it is harder to form clear narratives. So for children, for example, many child psychologists say that children need rituals or repeated patterns in their lives. And it's true that, first of all, of course, that creates a certain kind of trust that this is the way things will be happening, and it's easier to manage the world that is full of new things anyway. But it also helps memory, structure memory around certain clear things. In the situation of trafficking, we know that trafficking victims may be highly reluctant to disclose, and this may be due to several things. Many of them have skepticism towards and bad experiences of authorities. For example, many sex trafficking victims may have been subject to very harsh behavior on the part of authorities. Many trafficking victims may have histories of abuse and neglect. I will talk about this very soon, and they may have this kind of trauma bonding with the perpetrator that I will also soon dive into. They may be dependent on the perpetrator and have, in a way, from their point of view, much more reason to trust or to want to maintain a good relationship with the perpetrator than with the person who is with the authorities. They may also be self-blaming and seeing themselves as active agents to the abusive situation, and they may, in a way, quite reasonably even fear that matters will get only worse if they disclose. So they may be quite scared. Here you see Lisbeth Salander, who some of you know from the Millennium Trilogy, who here may be the not so perfect victim image. This is one thing that comes clearly about both in discussions with police officers and other practitioners, but also in the literature, that there is this somehow expectation on crime victims to be these pure and perfect victims. Many, for example, adolescents who have been subject to sexual human trafficking or related crimes, they may indeed be youngsters who look like Lisbeth Salander here and who are not at all impressed by the authority of police officers or other authorities. And this may be the result of very many cumulative challenges. One example in the trafficking context would be adolescents, and in particular in many, both practitioners and in writings, boys are referred to here, that they are boys with lacking background, security, who have grown up in unstable conditions, perhaps with no adults that they actually can trust, with histories of abuse and violence. They might quite easily, they might be sort of easy targets for example, criminal gangs, because they may be learning or really feel the need to belong to a group. It may be a group with clear guidelines of how to interact, and with this kind of brotherhood or something that may be actually very attractive for a person who have grown up without any sense of belonging anywhere. So these may really be lured into this kind of criminal behavior. And they may still be, of course, viewed by the criminal justice system as perpetrators. And this is really, I think, a cause of concern in many of our countries. So this is yet another reason to advocate for also suspect interviews to be conducted in a sensitive way, to make sure that you do not turn crime victims into perpetrators. Okay, I saw that some comment came in. Annina, are you still hearing me okay?
Yes, and the comment was just thank you.
Yes, yeah. I actually see them also on my other computer. Okay, do we need to have like a 2 minutes comfort break?
Yes, I think maybe it's a good idea.
Yeah, so let's have 3 minutes even.
Yes, so back at 12 or 11 Central European time.
Perfect.
Julia, you are muted. It still looks like you have the muted sign on the.
No, I didn't mute me, but for some reason it's okay. So I have to go back. I just wanted to tell you that I actually talked to the man who's renovating the the apartment next door, and he was nice enough to say that he'll stop until I'm done. So that was highly unfortunate. I hope it wasn't too annoying.
No.
Okay, let's continue, and now we'll go a bit more into the concepts of psychological coercion and control, which indeed are very crucial to investigations of human trafficking, also to some other crimes like intimate partnership violence. As has been many times stated in the literature, psychological coercion and control can be viewed as invisible chains, and these are highly problematic for the criminal justice system actors. It's much easier to give evidence for something that is tangible, that can be seen or can be explained, but it's actually quite hard for victims to explain why they were not able to get out of a difficult relationship, why they were not able to get out of the working conditions in which they were, and why they even wanted to stay there. So here I think we really need to look at the literature, and we need to update the knowledge of the criminal justice system actors to have this kind of understanding. First of all, it's of course using violence or threats of violence is a well-known way of manipulating people into acting the way perpetrators want them to act. But actual violence is not, according to research, necessary to create an atmosphere where the victim really feel that they do not have any alternatives other than obeying or conforming to the expectations of the perpetrator. And it's also well known that continuous psychological abuse, verbal abuse, humiliation, threats, etc., these really can break down the person's agency to the extent that they feel that they are completely unable as individuals to do things for themselves. So this really may lead to the sort of the situation that it's impossible to leave. Also, it's important to note that psychological coercion is not only negative interaction. It can be also these kinds of positive interactions where you sort of move between threats and verbal abuse to this kind of, everything is fantastic and you are really the most important person. In some sexual trafficking cases, it's a well-known sort of method that you start as a partner, boyfriend, lover, and the perpetrator is the partner, boyfriend, lover, gets, for example, a young girl from a very vulnerable background into a relationship, and there slowly the situation, when moving to another country, the situation changes completely, and this victim may be utterly alone and in the hands of the perpetrator. And again, you can see that previous vulnerability renders victims vulnerable to also this kind of activity. But the positive interaction, it also sort of creates solidarity with the perpetrator. So the victim may really, really be longing for positive interaction, for a good relationship, and sort of cling on to anything that is positive about the relationship. And human beings in general are actually quite good at not seeing what we do not want to see. This is also actually found in situations of love scams with people who in fact are not even all that vulnerable to their background, but who fall in love with an image of someone they would want to be in love with, and sort of actively disregard all the signs that this is not a good thing, this is not a true relationship. Another thing is that if you are as a victim alone in a new country, the language of which you do not speak, you have only one person you have any shared history with, and that is a person you realize is now using you, abusing you. It might still feel safer to remain with this perpetrator than going out to a completely unknown world where you have no idea if you will be even worse treated, where you have no clue about the language or the system or your rights for that matter. So the devil that is known may still be more appealing. For perpetrators, one effective measure to really take control of victims is to isolate them from any other persons that they may actually find support from their people from their own history. In some instances, what can be done is maybe the same as in some forms of where you have cults, for example, that you start sort of slowly making newcomers think that everyone else has actually been treating them bad, and we are now the ones who give you new possibilities and are treating you well. And if you then have broken up with everyone in your previous life and are alone with the perpetrator, then this is really an unfortunately good position for a perpetrator to manipulate a person into obedience and actions. And lastly, trauma bonding. Here we refer to the relationship with the victim and the perpetrator, where victims who have very little experiences of good relationships in their past, who have grown up in relationships that have been dangerous or have been abusive, they may actually again and again find themselves in these kinds of relationships. One of the presentations I did within the ELECT project was particularly for where there were several judges in the audience, and one of the judges said that the criminal justice system is so focused on dealing with the perpetrators, on making sure they get they have to take the consequences. But he had a case where the same female victim was for the third time in court with yet a new partner who had both physically abused her and her children. So he convicted the third man for abusing the same victim. And he said that it's so clear, he realized that the criminal justice system, that's the thing they cannot really affect. What happens with the victim? What support do they get after this? Do they get some kind of possibilities to move on in a better way with their lives? And this is something that I've found also in the literature on trauma bonding in relation to human trafficking victims, that actually the best way of protecting victims from future abuse, and we know there is a heightened risk for people who have previous criminal victimization backgrounds to again be victimized, that the best thing that can be done is to make sure they develop healthy and good relationships. Well, that's certainly easier said than done for anyone, and it's also certainly not in the hands of the criminal justice system. But it's also true that this is really the way we should be looking. So here again, maybe a collaboration with victim support services and looking at this particular issue is really of importance. Another thing, you probably have all heard of the Stockholm syndrome, which has been maybe a little bit misunderstood in the literature, where a person kept hostage sort of develops a very positive relationship or even love for the perpetrator. In the literature now, I think there is quite clear evidence that it is true that persons who are being kept hostage may start acting as in a way partners to the perpetrators, and there are cases in which they have actually liaised with the perpetrators, but in many cases it does seem more like a survival issue. People realize that this person is capable of really bad crimes, and if I don't behave, I am likely to be a next victim. So it really pays off to behave in a way that this perpetrator finds positive. And it's probably also true that may lead to this kind of positive interaction leading to the positive versus negative interaction cycle that may strengthen the bond between the perpetrator and the victim. Some of the features of trauma bonding found in a rather fresh review on the theme is an imbalance of power, the perpetrator using alternately positive and negative interactions, the gratitude of the victim for these positive interactions and the self-blame for the negative, and the victim assuming the perspective of the perpetrator. And again, as I myself have been working closely with the police for many years, also in intimate partner violence cases, this seems highly easy to recognize from that context as well. One feature, one type of trafficking-related crimes that are good examples of psychological coercion are online sexual abuse of especially children and adolescents. And there are many issues here that are important. There's some really interesting new research from Sweden with Malin Juleby, who did her PhD in the topic, showing that, among other things, that the criminal justice system does not really seem to assess online sexual abuse as negative or as detrimental to the psychological health of the victim as offline sexual abuse. So there seems to be a kind of both the thought that, well, the victim could have gotten out of the situation because the perpetrator wasn't even in the room, and maybe that, nothing all that bad could have happened because the victim was, after all, alone. But we know from studies and from cases that some of the children and adolescents who are controlled very well by the perpetrator, although it is online, have been doing extremely painful physical things to themselves. And actually, this bond seems to be just as strong and maybe even stronger in online cases because, as many of you would know, for adolescents today, the online world is completely as real and natural as the offline world. And what is going on in the online world may be even more powerful in the sense that the online, unfortunately, social media and the online context makes it very easy for a perpetrator to threaten the victim by saying that all these pictures will be all over the place or sent to your old parents at home or sent to your school unless you provide me with more. Another thing is that victims of sexual offenses in general are known to be blaming themselves for the victimization. But it has been found that many of the young victims of online sexual abuse might be doing that even more because, of course, they also feel that they have themselves handed over the pictures or performed live in a stream situation, and that is sort of what has lured them into being now easy targets for forcing to do other things. Okay. So I will now move on to investigative interviewing in trafficking cases, building on what was just said. There is not enough research yet on interviewing trafficking victims, and the context is to some extent different from investigative interviewing in other types of crimes. And it has been established that the police generally lack guidance on how to respond to and interact with these victims. We need to have more evidence also on how, like from victims themselves, researchers are starting to look at ways in which to, in a sensitive way, getting, in a way, advice from victims on how they would like to be discussed with, interviewed in these settings. And it is quite clear that if victims, as I said, may not be the kind of perfect victims. They may be evasive and they may be hostile. And this makes it even more difficult for the police to interact with them. But there is strong evidence for interviewing with other vulnerable groups and creating a report, focusing on recall memory, giving interviewees time, etc. And these are clearly basic principles that should be followed. And then we have just to try to look at what seems to work, listen to professionals and practitioners who have worked within these settings and collecting information on what they think is important. And then test this also to the extent possible in research. It's important to realize for investigators that the understanding of victimization may develop over the period of a rather long time. And we know, for example, that youthful victims of sex trafficking may realize they are victims only much later. This is typical for child sexual abuse more in general. And authorities may lack an understanding of this, and they may add pressure, which in itself may lead or increase the victims' lack of faith in and bad experiences of authorities. So if the criminal justice process actors come in with the thought that we will now save you and you should be grateful, and the victim does not act that way, it might really lead to a conflict. At Heuni, we have conducted a project called Sara, which is focusing on gender-based violence experiences of migrant women. And this was conducted in 4 different countries. You will find the information on Heuni's website. And in all these countries, female victims of sexual trafficking, and in particular Nigerian women, were mentioned. They were met in many of these contexts, and this was really a group that was found to struggle in their interaction with authorities, because authorities would get frustrated of their non-responsiveness, and on the other hand, the victims tended to have very, very bad experiences of interacting with authorities. So this is something we really have to look much more on. But also in Sweden, there is an interesting study looking at how Swedish police interview young trafficking victims, and these interviews have been found highly suggestive. And again, here it's been found that the victims avoid topics such as selling sex and relationships to the perpetrators, which is, of course, the core of the investigation. So it's not surprising that these issues are quite frustrating also for the police who conduct the investigative interviews. One particular aspect of, again, memory and how interviews in the context of human trafficking can be, or should be, what should be acknowledged is that compared to criminal cases with one main offense, here we are typically talking about repeated events over long periods of time, and that actually impacts memory so that we develop scripts. We don't have clear memories for all individuals situations, but we develop scripts. This is what usually happened, and it can be very difficult to separate between these similar experiences. People tend to remember the worst, the last, the first, things that sort of stick out. So these should be at least focused on. And Sonja Brobacher, who has done lots of research, especially in investigative interviews of children, has given quite good recommendations on how to really concretely in the interview address repeated events. In interactions where teaching police and consulting with the police, and also when looking at the literature, a few themes emerge that really are necessary to explore in these interviews. And we do want to know, of course, about the victims, sort of in a way about the psychological control, the context in which they've been to, what they have been forced or manipulated into doing. And these are difficult to ask about precisely. And I would say the best point of departure is really to ask about daily routines, as much as possible, information about everyday life, typical days, because that way you would be likely to get information on what was not part of typical days, what could not be done. For example, was it possible for the victim to go outside on their own, to buy their own things, etc. Many aspects of control versus freedom. This is partly thanks to the police in Helsinki focusing or specializing in trafficking investigations, and also discussions with international stakeholders and looking at the literature. So related to control and freedom, these themes emerge, talking about friends, social life outside the home or the place where the person is residing, means of contacting, how can they contact people if they want to, use of phone, social media. In many cases, the person does not have independent access to any of these. Bank cards, money, salaries, payments. This is, of course, incredibly important, both as a measure of control. If you control someone's economy, you have a pretty good advantage of that, but also, of course, in terms of labor exploitation, where the victim might actually consider that they are just doing work and they want to do work and everything is fine. So it might really be the authorities that need to get as much information as possible on the exact transfer of money, for example, to be able to make an assessment of the context. Things you can do, cannot do, what would have happened if you would have called your friend or gone out, etc. So always remembering to ask for how the victim perceived their own sort of degrees of freedom. What did you do if you needed something, needed to buy something, etc. These are pretty much the same thing. Circumstances of living. Did you have a room of your own? How did you sleep? What if you needed to wash? For women, for example, periods, food, going to the bathroom. This is not being allowed to go to the bathroom has been described as a means of punishment, for example, for victims of sex trafficking who have not obeyed to certain things. Relationships, and again, this is important not only for the criminal justice process itself, but also perhaps for the possibilities of directing further support to the victim. Who are the persons that you can rely on, etc. Timing of events here in interviews, it is typically good to focus on first, last, most important issue that happened somewhere else, to try to get those parts of memory that are out, that are a bit exceptional. And rather asking about concrete things than where exactly at what date something happened, because as already mentioned, people are really not very good at remembering exact dates. We tend to remember where we lived, and from that we can maybe extract when this happened, or when a child was born. Was it before this or after this? Although it has to be said, many of us can struggle also in Western countries with birth certificates and calendars to recall exact years. I was actually acting as a support person for a crime victim who remembered a thing would have happened to her after the birth of the second child, and later she discovered that she had been confused between the children, so it was after the third child, and that was many years later. And again, this is so this is really just the way normal memory works, and we have to acknowledge it. For online cases, this is just to say that we have an ongoing work on establishing new, or let's say modified guidance on how to interview children who have been victims of online sexual abuse. This is a joint effort together between HEUNI and CBSS, the Council of Baltic Sea States, and other partners. So keep your eyes on this if this is a theme that is relevant for your work. I have a few minutes to talk about interpretation. This is very brief, unless, Anniina, there is some questions, but I think I would actually probably see them myself.
Yeah, no questions in the chat.
Okay. So I will now just quickly say a few words about interpretation in the context of investigating human trafficking, and in general investigating crimes. We know that more and more victims are speaking another language than the authorities, and we do rely on interpreters to be able to communicate. It is a problem in the sense that, or a challenge is probably the more politically correct word, in the sense that we know there are studies showing that in many countries there are problematic issues emerging related to interpretation. And one of them is here in this quote that I put out by, which is by a registered court interpreter who participated in a specialization course for child forensic interviewing interpreters in Helsinki as part of a large Barnahus project in Finland. And this interpreter said that knowledge of language is not the same as a capacity to interpret. And this is really the first step. In many countries, it seems that the measure with which interpreters are chosen is simply economic. So you may have people who are not trained interpreters, who are certainly not registered court interpreters, to perform very important interpretations in court and in the police investigative interviews. So this is, of course, on a system level, this is something we have to look at. Then, if you are an interviewer yourself or a judge sitting in court already with no possibility to influence the way in which these things are on a system level handled with, you should at least make yourself aware on the the pitfalls in interpreted interviews. For example, how people are referred to may differ quite to an extent between languages. In Finnish, we don't even have a noun for a specific gender, so we say hän, which can be she or he or anything else. But most languages do separate between genders and clearly indicate if it's a man or a woman, or in English, if you say they, it can be that we don't know, or it's a non-binary person. In some languages, the pronouns even indicate position in society or gender, age. So this is something you have to be aware of. we've done now 3 trainings for these child interview interpreters in Finland. And as a trainer, I've learned much more from these trainings than I think the participants perhaps even, because it really opened up all the ways in which we have to be clear on all these pitfalls that can occur. One thing was that in sign languages, in all other languages, it seems to be fairly easy to ask open-ended questions. But in sign languages, at least in the Finnish sign language, I got the impression that it's quite difficult. And the interpreters then need to make a very informed decision on what are the kinds of closed questions that are the least problematic in the setting. If they don't know that closed questions are problematic and why, that it's all about the way memory works, they will not be able to make these informed decisions. So interpreters really would need to be trained on a system level in these issues. Also, words that in one language may be neutral, may be sort of loaded in another. So you say the word event in English, it could be very positive in another language or very negative. And if you are not, if the interpreter is not aware that now we're actually just here to talk about neutral events, for example, when just talking about anything before going to the actual interview theme, then it may result in really taking the discussion in a direction that the interviewer did not mean for it to do. And we know that sexuality and sexual terms, they are difficult all over, across the board, in any language. It's difficult for people to discuss their own sexual experiences with an authority. My guess is this is pretty much the case for any person from any context. But in some culture, these are very much more less talked about than in others. And also, for example, euphemisms may be used. So you talk about sleeping together rather than having intercourse. And these may have still, these euphemisms, very clear and strict meanings. So we really need to know about this. It's also been stated both by interpreters themselves, and it's also been a concern found in research, that interpreters may avoid direct translations out of courtesy or because they are worried about using such and such words, for example, with children. So this can be highly problematic as well. And again, sexual abuse, beating, violence, these may hold different meanings in different languages and really get lost in translation. And I've seen this in many practical cases very, very clearly. So training and preparation is crucial. If you have a case going on and you have an interpreter, the best thing at least would be to try to go through the possible pitfalls, discuss the kinds of topics that will be discussed, think of whether there are words with many meanings and how for the interpreter to then state that during the interview if there's a risk for misunderstanding. Here is just the almost last slide with an example from an interview with a Romanian female victim. This is from Lauren Wilson's PhD called Lost in Interpretation, where she, among other things, talked about trafficking. So you can see here that the officer asks, at any point, had she touched him? Had she put her hand on his penis? Was he aroused? Was he hard? And the translation goes, have you tried at some point, or did you touch him, or was he excited? This is, of course, a very bad question in itself, so it's not surprising that it's hard to translate. But the translation is also here struggling. Based on this, you can give already one advice that is really one of the most important advice for interviewers when they are dealing with interpreter-assisted interviews, is that keep your questions brief and clear, because it's very hard to interpret a question that is all over the place. Training of interviews and interpreters together would be fantastic, but if that's not possible, at least preparing for the interviews together with the interview beforehand. What topic will be discussed? What are the crucial words? How can this be asked about in a non-leading way? And what to do if there are unclarities in the communication? And I do think and have the experience that really a lot can be learned from one another. I just have a few resources. I did not talk at this in this talk about how how culture affects investigative interviews to any longer extent. But here is one article that I would advise you to look at. There is a direct link to these articles on these slides. So when you get them, you can just click the slide and you should be opening up the actual article. Another one is dealing with culture, trauma, and memory in investigative interviews by excellent researchers. Also, those of you who deal with child trafficking issues, I did not particularly focus on child trafficking issues at the moment, but this is a topic that I've been working with quite a bit the last year, and together with, or within a CBSS led project, Heuni is participating. We're working on a handbook on child interviews. So this will be coming up, and there is a webinar that has been recorded, and also this will be, you can find this webinar if you click this slide. And of course, for more information on Heuni's trafficking, on the ELECT resources, you will of course use our ELECT THB website, and among other things, we are working now on a policy brief for criminal justice process actors and many other things. So we strongly invite you to have a look at that. Thank you. This was a very, how would I say, presentation with quite a lot of material. I hope it wasn't too much in a run.
Yeah, thanks so much, Julia. I think it was very relevant and interesting, at least on my part. And we would, like we said, we have recorded this, and we will share that along with Julia's slides later on. And the ELECT THB project is also developing training material online, which will include some separate videos recorded by Julia and other colleagues that you will hopefully find useful. And then we would also like to ask that you give us some feedback regarding this webinar, as it's EU funded. So I hope that my colleague Alexandra will be able to share the link now in the chat. And then we will also email it to participants of this webinar. So thanks so much at least on my behalf, and thanks so much, Julia, for this interesting presentation. You're getting a lot of compliments in the chat.
Thank you.
So stay tuned with us, the ELECT THB. We will do 2 more webinars on different topics in August, and please follow us on social media, and all our materials are available also on our website. Thanks so much. Bye, and have a lovely summer and midsummer celebrations to the Nordics among us and Baltics.